My father never would have left without saying goodbye. That is the one thing I knew. That is the one thing I held on to for 7 years while everyone around me decided I was wrong. While the sheriff's department closed the file. While my own cousins stopped returning my calls. While my marriage frayed at the edges from the weight of what I would not put down. My father was Ray Halloway. He ran Halloway Hardware on the main square in Cedar Hollow, Tennessee for 31 years. He knew every customer by name. He kept a jar of peppermints on the counter that had been there since before I was born. He called me every Sunday at 8 in the morning, without fail. From the time I moved to Knoxville at 22, until the Sunday the calls stopped. He would not have left without saying goodbye. He would not have left without telling me. He was not that kind of man. She was that kind of woman. Her name was Brenda Cole. She came into my father's life 18 months after my mother died, and she came into it the way certain people come into the lives of grieving men, quietly, warmly, with exactly the right words at exactly the right moments. She was 15 years younger than him, and she had moved to Cedar Hollow from somewhere outside Chattanooga, and nobody in town knew much about her before she arrived. Within 4 months, she was having dinner at his house. Within 8 months, they were married. The town called it a second spring. They were happy for him. He had been so lonely since my mother passed, and here was this warm, pretty woman who seemed to adore him. And the town of Cedar Hollow decided to be glad about it, and I stood at their wedding and smiled, and felt something settle wrong in my chest, like a stone that would not move. I was not wrong about the stone. I want to tell you that up front. I want you to know that everything I felt that day turned out to be accurate. But knowing you were right does not make the 7 years easier to look back on. It does not give me back the time. It does not give me back my father. What it gives me is this. The truth finally said out loud. My father's name said correctly, and Brenda Cole sitting in a courtroom in Hardin County, being held accountable for what she did to the man who trusted her with everything he had left. This is the story of the 7 years between the stone and the verdict. And it is the story of the Sunday the calls stopped. My mother's name was Eleanor. She was the kind of woman who made a house feel like a place people wanted to be. She baked on Saturdays. She sang in the choir at First Methodist for 23 years. She knew the names of every child in the neighborhood, and she remembered their birthdays, and she sent cards, handwritten, every single year, without exception. She was diagnosed in February and gone by October. That is how fast it moved. 8 months from the word cancer to the day we buried her in the cemetery on the hill outside of town with the cedar trees that give Cedar Hollow its name. 8 months. And then the house on Maple Street was just a house, and my father was just a man standing in it not knowing what to do with his hands. I moved back home for 3 months after the funeral. I could not leave him there alone. I helped him go through her things, which was the hardest thing I have ever done. Not because of the things themselves, though the things were hard, because of the way he touched each one. He was not theatrical about it. He did not perform his grief. He just held each thing for a moment longer than necessary. Like he was trying to remember the exact weight of it, and then he set it down carefully and moved to the next. He was not a man who needed to be watched. He was a man who needed to be known. He needed someone to understand the specific texture of his loss, without having to explain it. I understood it. I had lost the same woman. We sat in that house for 3 months and we understood each other without saying much. And when I finally had to go back to Knoxville, he walked me to my car and he held on longer than usual, and he said, "Call me when you get there." I called him when I got there. He picked up before it rang twice. That Sunday ritual, the 8 o'clock calls, that was not something we agreed on formally. It just became what we did. He would call and I would answer, and we would talk for 20 or 30 minutes about nothing in particular. The hardware store, the weather, what I had been cooking, whether the Vols were going to have a decent season. Small things. The kind of small things that are actually the substance of a relationship when you let them be. The calls went on for a year after my mother died. And then Brenda Cole started answering his phone. I noticed it before I could name it. The first time she answered, I thought it was a mistake. He had mentioned meeting someone, just briefly, in the way of a private man who is not sure how much to say. I asked him about her once and he said she was kind and she made him laugh, and he said it with a particular shyness that I recognized as real. He was not performing happiness. He had actually found some. I tried to be glad. I know I tried because I remember the effort of it. I had a conversation with myself in my car outside my apartment in Knoxville where I said to myself that my father was 63 years old and he had been lonely for a year, and if this woman made him laugh then that was a good thing, and I was going to treat it as a good thing. I met Brenda for the first time at Sunday dinner in April. She was attractive in a careful way, the kind of attractive that suggests maintenance rather than accident. She was warm with the particular warmth of someone who has decided in advance to be warm. She asked me questions about my work, and she remembered the answers and brought them back later in the conversation, and I recognized the technique because it was a technique and I could see it being applied. My father watched me watching her. He wanted me to approve. I could see that too. He was a man who had always wanted peace in his family, and he needed me to find her acceptable, and I sat at that table and I told myself the discomfort was mine to manage, not his. I managed it for 8 months. By the time they got married, I had almost convinced myself I was wrong about the stone. I was not wrong about the stone. The stone knew things my conscious mind had not yet assembled into evidence. Here is what I noticed in those 8 months. Brenda asked about the hardware store's finances twice in casual conversation, in ways that were too specific to be casual. She asked once about whether my father had a will, framed as something she had read about the importance of estate planning. She asked about my mother's jewelry once, in a way that suggested she had already been looking at it. Small things, each one explainable. Together they added up to something I could feel but not yet prove. I told my father. Once. Carefully. After the wedding, when I felt I had no other choice, I said I had some concerns. I said I wanted him to be careful with the financial things. I said I loved him, and I just wanted him to be careful. He listened. He thanked me. He said Brenda was a good woman and he knew I was worried and he appreciated it. And then he said the thing that fathers say when they have heard something they are not ready to hear. He said he did not want any trouble at home. He said things were good and he wanted them to stay that way. I went home and I wrote down the date of the conversation in a notebook. I did not know then that the notebook would become the thing that 7 years later gave investigators somewhere to start. I just knew I needed to write it down. The changes in my father happened gradually, and then all at once, which is how changes happen when someone is being isolated from the outside without knowing it. The gradual part was the calls. They got shorter. He sounded distracted. When I asked if everything was all right, he said of course and moved on quickly. The calls shifted from Sunday mornings to whenever Brenda had errands, which was less predictable and therefore less reliable. And a reliable call with my father was not just a habit. It was the structure of my relationship with him. Removing the structure removed something I could not immediately replace. Then Brenda started answering. Not every time. Sometimes he answered, and he was fine. But increasingly, when I called on Sunday morning, her voice was the one I heard. She was cheerful about it. She said Ray was just in the other room. She said he was doing great. She said she would have him call me back. He usually did call back, but sometimes not until Tuesday, and when he did, he sounded tired. The "oh lot once" part was the spring visit where I drove down and found new locks on the front door and had to knock and wait. I had always had a key to that house. I had grown up in that house. My key had worked at Christmas, and it did not work in April. I stood on the porch of my childhood home, and knocked on the door, and waited, and Brenda opened it. She said they had changed the locks because of a locksmith they had hired, who she was not sure about. She said she had meant to get me a new key, and kept forgetting. She smiled the careful warm smile. My father came down the hallway behind her, and he looked at me and he looked smaller than he had at Christmas. Not physically. In the way a person looks smaller when they are inside something that is pressing on them. He said, come in, why are you standing on the porch? I went in, I had dinner, I helped with the dishes. I drove home and I added to the notebook. The locks, the calls, the finances, the jewelry. My mother had left me her gold collection when she died. Not a formal bequest. She had told me in the last weeks that the pieces were for me. Small things. A bracelet, a ring, 2 pendants. Nothing extraordinary in dollar terms but not replaceable in any other terms. She had shown me where she kept them, a cedar box in the top of her closet. I went looking for the cedar box in June and it was not there. I asked my father about it without mentioning Brenda. He said he was not sure where Eleanor had kept her jewelry. He had never paid much attention to that kind of thing. He seemed genuinely unsure. I went home and I added to the notebook. The savings account came out in August. My father mentioned it himself, almost in passing, as if it were not significant. He said they had done some work on the house, and it had cost more than expected, and the savings had taken a hit. I asked what work. He said some plumbing and a new water heater. I drove to Cedar Hollow the following week and I looked at the plumbing and the water heater, both of which appeared to be untouched, and I added to the notebook and I went to visit a lawyer friend in Knoxville to ask what, if anything, I could do. The lawyer said almost nothing. She said no crime had been committed that she could identify. She said financial decisions within a marriage were generally the purview of the people in the marriage. She said if I had serious concerns about my father's welfare, I could speak to Adult Protective Services, but the bar for intervention was high. She said I could keep documenting. I kept documenting. He disappeared on a Tuesday in September. I know it was a Tuesday because he had called me the Thursday before, unexpectedly, which was unusual enough that I noted it. The Thursday call was short. He sounded careful in the way of someone who is choosing words around someone who is listening. He asked about my job. He asked about the weather in Knoxville. He said he loved me. He said it with an emphasis that was also unusual, slightly heavier than the ordinary way he said it. And I said I loved him too, and after I hung up I sat with the call for a long time trying to understand what it had been. I think it was a goodbye. I have thought about that for 7 years and I still think it was a goodbye. I think something had happened in the house that week that made him understand, in a way he had not fully understood before, the nature of what he was living inside. I think he had found out about the money, or the jewelry, or both, and I think he had confronted her, and I think she had understood that confrontation meant she was out of time. I did not know any of that on Thursday. I just knew the call felt like a stone dropped into still water, and I was still watching the ripples when Brenda called me Tuesday morning to say my father was gone. She was very convincing on the phone. I want to say that because it is true, and because it makes everything harder to explain. She cried. She said she did not understand. She said they had not been fighting. Everything had been fine. She had woken up and he was simply gone. She said his truck was still in the driveway. She said she did not know what to do. I drove to Cedar Hollow in under 2 hours. When I got there, Brenda was on the porch with 2 of the neighbors and she came down to meet me and she put her arms around me and she cried against my shoulder and I stood inside that embrace and felt the stone in my chest turn into something colder. His truck was in the driveway. I looked at it for a long time. My father's truck was his. It was not a vehicle he was sentimental about, but it was the vehicle he used for everything, and it was in the driveway, and he was not anywhere, and the combination of those 2 facts told me, in the immediate certain way that the stone had always spoken, that he had not left. He had not left, he had been taken. I did not say this to Brenda. I went inside and I sat with the neighbors and I drank the coffee someone made and I watched Brenda move through the house with the particular fluency of someone who had rehearsed grief. She knew where to stand. She knew when to cry. She knew which neighbors to lean on and when to look lost and when to look brave. She was doing a performance and it was a very good performance and she was doing it 6 hours after my father went missing, and I sat in the kitchen of the house where I grew up, and I watched her and I understood that I was watching a person who had done what she had done and was now managing the aftermath. I could not prove it. That was the thing I could not stop sitting with. I could feel it the way I had felt everything else about her. In the place that was below logic. In the place that the stone lived. But feeling is not evidence. Knowing is not evidence. The notebook was not evidence. I needed evidence. I needed to find it before it disappeared the way the money had disappeared, and the jewelry had disappeared, and the specific weight of my father's presence in a room had disappeared. The search lasted 3 weeks. Brenda led it. That is the part that I still cannot fully make sense of when I sit with it long enough. Even now, even with everything I know about what she did. She organized the search. She made the flyers. She stood in the parking lot of the First Methodist Church with her hair pulled back and her eyes red, and she said my husband would never leave. If you know Ray Holloway, you know he would never leave. Please help me find him. The town of Cedar Hollow showed up. People who had known my father his whole life came out on cold October mornings and walked fields and checked ditches and put flyers in windows, and believed her. They believed her because she was crying, and because the performance was very good, and because the town wanted to believe that their neighbor Ray was going to come home. I stood next to her at the search events. I handed out flyers with my father's face on them. I thanked people for coming. I did all of it because there was nothing else to do, and because if there was any chance I was wrong, any chance at all, I was not going to be the daughter who refused to look for her father. I was not wrong. But I did not know yet where he was. The sheriff's department was professional and thorough, and they got nowhere. There was no physical evidence of a crime. There was no body. There was Brenda's account, which was consistent and detailed. And there was the truck in the driveway, which was strange but not impossible to explain. Maybe he had gotten a ride. Maybe he had been picked up. Maybe he had been planning to leave for reasons nobody knew about. I went to the sheriff after the first week. I brought the notebook. I laid out everything I had documented over the previous 2 years. The financial changes. The locked door. The savings account. The jewelry. The Thursday phone call. The deputy who took my report was respectful and careful, and he told me they would look into it. And I could see in his eyes that he thought I was a daughter who was in pain and looking for someone to blame. That became the story. Diane Holloway, the bitter stepdaughter who could not accept that her father had moved on. Diane Holloway, who had never liked Brenda and was now using a missing persons case to settle old scores. My father's sister called me and said she thought I needed to let the professionals do their job and stop making things harder for Brenda, who was suffering enough. My cousin from Murfreesboro sent me a long text about the importance of grief processing. I put the text in the notebook and kept going. The file went cold 6 months after my father disappeared. Brenda sold the house on Maple Street. She sold it quickly and for a fair price to a young couple who did not know the history, and she moved to a place outside of Nashville, and she started, from what I could tell, through the narrow windows of her social media presence, a new and comfortable life. I watched from Knoxville. I documented what I could. I called the sheriff's department every 90 days and asked if there had been any developments, and was told each time that the case remained open, and they would contact me if anything changed. My marriage did not survive it. I want to say that plainly, because it is part of the cost of what happened, and the cost should be named. My husband was a good man, and he had been patient with me for a long time, and the patience had limits, and when the limits were reached I understood completely. He said he needed me to accept that we might never have answers, and to find a way to be present in our life. I said I could not do that. He said he knew. We separated in the 4th year, and divorced in the 5th. I do not blame him. I also would not have done anything differently. When something is true, you stay with it even when the staying costs you things you did not want to lose. I knew something was true. I stayed with it. The notebook had 3 volumes by then. Dates, phone call records, notes from the conversations I had had with the sheriff's department. A timeline I had rebuilt from everything I could piece together about the last week of my father's life. The Thursday call and what it had sounded like. The money and when it had moved. The neighbors who had noticed things and had not known what to make of them. I kept the notebook because I did not know what else to do with what I knew. Keeping it made it feel like it was going somewhere. Like the information was being held for a purpose that had not arrived yet. The purpose arrived 7 years after the Tuesday in September, when Brenda called me to say my father was gone. A new deputy named Marcus Threlkeld transferred to the Hardin County Sheriff's Department in the late spring of the 7th year. He was 32 years old and he had a habit, his supervisor told me later, of reading through old unresolved cases on slow nights because he found the patterns in them instructive. He pulled my father's file on a Wednesday evening because the summary had an anomaly that snagged something in his thinking. The anomaly was the truck. A man who plans to leave does not leave his truck. That was what snagged. It was the same thing that had snagged me on the day I arrived in Cedar Hollow and stood in the driveway. Marcus Threlg looked at the file and felt the snag, and he pulled the thread. The thread led to Brenda's brother Wayne Cole. Wayne had been arrested in the intervening years on an unrelated charge in a different county, and during the processing of that arrest, certain information had come into the possession of law enforcement that they had not yet connected to anything. A storage unit. Access records. A piece of property outside of Cedar Hollow that Wayne had rented briefly, and then stopped renting, about 6 weeks after the Tuesday in September. Marcus Threlkeld connected it. He also pulled my notebooks. I had submitted the originals to the sheriff's department 6.5 years earlier. They had been in the file. Nobody had worked through them line by line in the way Marcus Threlkeld worked through them. He spent 3 days with the notebooks and the property records and the cell signal data from Wayne's phone in the weeks surrounding my father's disappearance, and then he went to his supervisor and he said, "I think I know what happened." They brought Brenda in for questioning. She had maintained her story for 7 years, and it was a practiced story, and she told it again. With the same practiced precision. But 7 years is a long time, and the details of a story that is not true tend to drift in small ways that are invisible to the person telling it, and visible to a careful investigator who has read 3 volumes of a notebook prepared by a woman who had been paying attention for 7 years. Marcus Threlkeld caught 3 drifts. 3 small places where the practiced story did not quite match what it had said 7 years before. He brought the drifts back to her, and she explained them, and he brought them back again, and the explanations got more elaborate and more elaborate. Explanations require more careful management, and eventually the management becomes impossible. Wayne Cole came apart first. He had been carrying it for 7 years in a way that had not been comfortable, and when investigators told him what they had from the cell records and the property records, he understood that the story was over. He asked for a deal. He said my father had confronted Brenda about the money and about what he had found, and she had shot him in the kitchen of the house on Maple Street. He said he had helped her move the body. He said where. It was an empty tract of land, 8 miles outside of Cedar Hollow, that had been part of an estate that changed hands twice since my father disappeared. Wayne had known about it through a connection from a job he had worked years before. They had buried my father at the far edge of the property near a stand of pine trees. Marcus Threlkeld called me on a Thursday morning. I had been waiting for the call for 7 years, and it still stopped me in the middle of getting ready for work. He said they had a credible lead on my father's location and that they were going to be executing a search of the property that afternoon, and he wanted me to know before they went out there. He said I did not have to be there. He said if I wanted to be there they could accommodate that. I said I wanted to be there. He said he understood. I drove to Cedar Hollow one more time. The last time I had driven that road had been for the divorce proceedings, and before that for a conversation with the sheriff's department that had gone nowhere. The road had not changed. The cedar trees were still there. The town square still had Halloway Hardware on the corner, though it was a different business now, a gift shop that sold candles and pottery, and the jar of peppermints was long gone. The property was outside town on a county road I did not know. I parked behind the row of official vehicles and I walked to where the investigators were setting up their search perimeter. Marcus Threlkeld found me and shook my hand and said he was glad I had come. I stood at the edge of the tree line and I watched the dig team work. I want to describe this to you accurately because I think it deserves accuracy. The waiting was not dramatic. It was slow and cold, and the afternoon light was the low flat light of late autumn, and the pine trees moved slightly in the wind, and I stood with my coat pulled around me, and I did not cry, and I did not speak, and I watched. They found something at about 4 in the afternoon. A deputy came to where I was standing and said they had found something and asked me to step back. I stepped back. I watched the activity near the tree line intensify. People moved carefully and deliberately, and they called to each other in the professional shorthand of people doing something they have been trained to do. An hour later, Marcus Threlkeld came to where I was standing. He said they had found remains. He said it was preliminary, but the location matched. He said they would need time for confirmation, but he wanted me to know. I looked at him and I said thank you. He said he was sorry it had taken this long. I said it had taken as long as it took, and what mattered was that it had happened. Then I walked back to my car, and I sat in the driver's seat, and I put my hands on the steering wheel, and I cried for the first time in 7 years. Not because I was surprised, because I had been holding it for 7 years, and there was finally somewhere to put it down. The proof existed. My father existed, in the record, as someone who had been taken, not someone who had left. Not someone who had been too much trouble to look for. Someone who had been wronged, and who now, finally, had the wrong named. Brenda Cole was arrested 2 weeks after the dig. The charge was first-degree murder. Wayne was charged as an accessory. They were tried separately. Brenda's trial lasted 9 days. I was in the courtroom every day. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecution, and I watched the case that 7 years of keeping notebooks had helped build be laid out piece by piece in front of 12 people who had not known my father and did not have a stone in their chest, and who had to be convinced through evidence alone. The evidence was enough. The cell records, Wayne's testimony, the financial records that the prosecution had reconstructed, showing the movement of money from my father's accounts in the months before his death. The jewelry, some of which was recovered from a pawn shop outside Nashville, where Brenda had sold it 2 months after my father disappeared. My mother's bracelet was in the evidence photos. I looked at it and I thought about the cedar box in the top of the closet, and I thought about my mother's hands. I did not look away. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. Guilty, first-degree murder. The judge set sentencing for 60 days out, and Brenda was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I watched her go, and I felt the stone finally, after 7 years, begin to dissolve. Not all at once, some things dissolve slowly, but I felt it begin. I buried my father next to my mother in the cemetery on the hill outside Cedar Hollow with the cedar trees. It was December, and the ground was cold, and the trees moved in the wind, the same way they had moved on the afternoon of the dig, and I stood at the grave in my coat, and I said goodbye to a man I had already said goodbye to 7 years before, without knowing that is what I was doing. The town of Cedar Hollow came to the burial. Some of the people who had called me bitter came and stood at the grave with their hats in their hands and looked at the ground. I did not say anything to them about it. The time for that was past. What I said to anyone who spoke to me that day was that I was grateful my father had been found, and that I was glad. The truth was on the record, and that I was ready to go home. Marcus Threlkeld came. He stood at the back with his hat in his hands like the rest of them. After the service, he shook my hand again and said he hoped I could find some peace now. I said I thought I could. I said it, and I believed it in a way I had not been able to believe anything peaceful for a very long time. My father's name is Ray Halloway. He ran Halloway Hardware on the main square in Cedar Hollow, Tennessee for 31 years. He knew every customer by name. He kept a jar of peppermints on the counter. He called me every Sunday at 8 in the morning. He did not leave without saying goodbye. I always knew that. The record finally says so too. Some truths take 7 years to reach the surface. The waiting is not the end of the story. The waiting is just the part between the knowing and the proof. You hold what you know. You document it. You do not put it down, no matter what it costs you. Then the proof comes. And it comes because someone paid attention and kept paying attention and refused to decide that the absence of evidence was the same thing as the absence of truth. My name is Diane Halloway. My father came home. That is the whole story. I want to tell you about Halloway Hardware because it is impossible to understand my father without understanding the store. He opened it at 31 with a loan from his own father and a location nobody thought would work. The building was small, and the square in Cedar Hollow already had a general store that sold some of the same things. People told him it was redundant. He said he was not competing with the general store. He was serving a different customer. He was right. The customer he was serving was the person who came in not knowing exactly what they needed. The homeowner facing a project they had never done before. The farmer with a piece of equipment that needed a part nobody stocked. The woman who came in because the pipe under her kitchen sink was making a sound she did not understand and she needed someone to explain what the sound meant. My father explained things. That was his gift. He could take a complicated mechanical problem and break it down into language that a person who had never touched a wrench in their life could follow. He was patient in a way that was not performed patience. He was genuinely interested in the problem. He wanted to figure it out with you. He also remembered everything. If you came in April with a question about your water heater, and came back in October for something else, he would ask how the water heater had worked out. People felt known in that store. They felt like they mattered as individuals rather than as transactions. That feeling does not come from training. It comes from the actual character of the person behind the counter. The store was also where he grieved my mother. Not in any visible way. He did not talk about her at work. He did not bring his sadness into the store. But I think the routine of it, the opening at 7, and the peppermints and the familiar faces, I think it was the thing that held him together in the months after she died. Purpose does that. It gives sorrow something to move around, rather than sitting with it until it fills everything. He sold the store 3 months before he disappeared. I did not know that until the investigators found the sale records. He had sold it quietly to a man from Savannah, who wanted to turn it into a gift shop and had offered a fair price. He had not told me. He would have told me eventually, but he had not yet. The investigators believe he was planning to leave Brenda, that the sale of the store was part of a plan to liquidate what he could and establish some independence from the financial situation she had created. That the confrontation my cousin Wayne described was connected to my father having made those decisions without telling her and Brenda understanding what they meant. He had been trying to get out. That is what I carry. Not just that she killed him. That he had seen it clearly and had been trying to get out, and she had understood. That her opportunity was closing and she had acted before he could finish what he was doing. I wish he had called me. I know why he didn't. He was a private man, and he had made his choices, and he was trying to manage a situation without involving me, because he knew it would worry me. That was him. Protecting me from the weight of his problems even when he was inside the worst one. The Thursday call was as close as he could get to telling me. I still believe that. I still hear it when I think about it. The extra weight on the words. The I love you that was heavier than it needed to be. I hear it, and I am glad he said it. It is all I have of the goodbye he was not given the chance to give properly. There were 3 neighbors on Maple Street who saw things they did not know what to do with. Margaret Forsyth lived directly across the street. She was 74 years old, and she had lived in that house since before I was born, and she had watched the Holloway family from her kitchen window for decades, the way neighbors in small towns watch each other as a function of proximity rather than intention. She saw things. She saw the truck parked in the driveway on the Monday before my father disappeared, and she saw it still there Tuesday morning. She saw Brenda's brother Wayne's vehicle parked on the street for 2 nights running the week before, which was unusual because Wayne had not been a regular visitor. She saw lights in the basement on the Tuesday night, and she saw them go off sometime after midnight. She told me all of this in the months after my father disappeared. She told it carefully, with the caution of a person who is not sure whether what she noticed constitutes anything. She was not sure it was relevant. She was not sure she had the right to say it, given that Brenda was her neighbor, and Brenda was clearly suffering. I wrote it down, dates, times, what she had seen. I put it in the notebook. She told the same things to the sheriff's department when they came to canvass the neighborhood. I do not know how carefully they took it down. What I know is that it was not in the original summary of the investigation in any prominent way. It was in the supplemental notes where it had been filed and where it sat for 7 years until Marcus Threlkeld read through everything line by line. Margaret Forsyth was still living on Maple Street when the arrest happened. She called me the day the news ran. She said she was glad they had found him. She said she was sorry she had not spoken more forcefully at the time. I told her she had spoken and it had been written down and it had contributed to what happened. She said she should have gone back. She said she had thought about it and had talked herself out of it. I told her that was a human thing to do. She said yes. She said sometimes the human thing is not the right thing. I said sometimes it is not. We were quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Give your father my regards." She caught herself. She said, "You know what I mean." I said I did. I said I would. The second neighbor was a retired plumber named Gary Sims, who had done work at the Halloway house twice over the years, and who had noticed that the plumbing my father mentioned needing to fix had not in fact been fixed. He had gone over in November to offer to help, since he knew my father was not a plumber, and had been told by Brenda that everything was fine and they had hired someone. He had not believed it, and he had not known what to do with not believing it. He put it in a note he left at the sheriff's department in December of the first year. The note was in the file. It was in the supplemental materials Marcus Threlkeld read 7 years later. The third was a woman named Cheryl at the Cedar Hollow First Methodist Church, who had been in the prayer circles Brenda organized and who had told me privately, at a church event 2 months after my father vanished, that something about the prayer circles felt wrong to her. She said she could not say exactly what. She said Brenda led them with a conviction that was a particular kind of conviction. She said she had been praying for Ray at home on her own and it felt different from the prayer circles. She said she did not know what to do with that. I wrote it down. Not as evidence. As the record of a community's unease that could not name itself. The community had known. Not consciously. Not in any way that constituted knowledge. But in the way that communities sometimes sense things in their proximity to each other. The accumulation of small wrongnesses that individually mean nothing and together mean something. They just did not have the language for it, and the performance was too good, and Brenda was standing right there crying, and it was easier to believe the crying than to trust the unease. I trusted the unease. For 7 years I trusted it. That is the only thing I did that was unusual. I just did not stop. I have been asked in various forms, since the verdict, whether it was worth it, whether the 7 years were worth the marriage, and the years and the loneliness, and the particular cost of being the person everyone thought was wrong. I do not think worth it is the right frame. Worth it implies a transaction. That if the outcome is good enough, the cost becomes acceptable. I do not think about the 7 years that way. I think about them as the time between knowing and proving. The proving was always going to happen, or it was not. I could not control that. What I could control was whether I kept the record, and kept making the calls, and kept adding to the notebook. I would have done the same things if the verdict had never come. That is what I want people to understand. I was not holding on because I expected vindication. I was holding on because my father did not leave without saying goodbye, and someone needed to be the person who would not pretend otherwise. What 7 years costs is this. It costs you the patience of the people around you who love you and need you to be present, and find that your presence is always partially elsewhere. My husband could not get all of me because part of me was always in Cedar Hollow, in the space between what I knew and what I could prove. That is not his fault. That is not my fault. It is the cost of the thing. It costs you your certainty in your own perception. Not immediately. Over time. The gaslighting does not have to be direct. The world around you deciding you are wrong has its own effect on a person even when the person is not listening. You begin to audit your own memories. You check the notebook to make sure the dates match what you remember. You replay the Thursday call wondering if you are adding weight to it retroactively. The doubt is not about the facts. The facts are in the notebook. The doubt is about your right to trust the feeling underneath the facts. I won that doubt most days. Some days I did not win it, and I sat in my apartment in Knoxville feeling exactly like what everyone said I was. A bitter woman who could not accept reality. Those were the hardest days. Not because I believed it, but because fighting a feeling requires energy, and the energy was finite. What 7 years gives you, if you hold through all of it, is a particular kind of knowledge about yourself. You find out that you can carry something true for a very long time without it being confirmed. You find out that the confirmation, when it comes, does not feel like victory. It feels like gravity. Like a thing that was always true, becoming visible. Like the ground rising up to meet what was falling through the air. I did not feel triumphant in that courtroom. I felt relieved, and I felt the weight of what my father had not been able to do for himself, and I felt the 7 years settling into something that had a shape now. The shape of a true thing finally said out loud. That is what 7 years gives you if you hold through it. The truth with a shape. A father with his name correctly on the record. It is not worth it in the transactional sense. Nothing is worth what it cost. But it was true, and I held it, and the holding mattered, and my father came home. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. I want to say something about the man who read the notebook. Marcus Threlkeld was 32 years old when he transferred to the Hardin County Sheriff's Department. He had grown up in a small town not far from Cedar Hollow, and he had gone into law enforcement out of what he described to me later as a simple belief that unresolved things should be resolved. He said he could not account for where the belief came from. He said it was just how he had always been wired. He worked through the cold case files on his own time. His supervisor knew about it and allowed it because Marcus was thorough and because the department had a policy of reviewing old cases periodically, and Marcus was providing that review at no additional cost. He worked through them systematically, oldest first, looking for the snag, the detail that did not sit right, the thing that had been noted and filed and left. He found my father's file on a Wednesday evening in late May. He later told me he almost skipped it because the summary suggested a straightforward voluntary disappearance. He read the summary and started to move to the next file, and something made him go back. He said he was not sure what it was. He said sometimes you just feel the snag before you find it. He found the truck. He went back and read the full file. He found the notebook. He spent 3 days with it. I had not spoken to the sheriff's department in 8 months when Marcus Threlkeld called me. I had been calling every 90 days for 6.5 years, and I had stopped calling because the 90-day calls had become a ritual that was not serving anything, and the ritual was costing me something I could not afford to keep spending. I had not put the case down. I had just stopped making the call. He called me. That mattered. He called me and he said he had been reading the file and he had some questions about the timeline and he wanted to know if I would be willing to talk. I said yes before he finished the sentence. He asked his questions and I answered them from memory, and I could hear him writing. He was the first person in law enforcement who had asked me questions and written down the answers in a way that felt like the writing was going somewhere. He found Wayne Cole's connection to the property for days after that call. He connected the cell records 10 days after that. The investigation moved faster in those 6 weeks than it had in 7 years, because one person had decided to read a notebook line by line and ask the question it was asking. At my father's graveside he stood at the back with his hat in his hands. I went to him afterward and I shook his hand and I said thank you. He said he was glad he had found the snag. He said he was sorry it had taken so long for someone to look for it. I said he had looked for it. That was the thing. He had looked. That was the whole difference. Someone had looked. Week after the burial, I drove to Cedar Hollow one more time. Not for any official purpose. Just to be there. To drive the square and see the building where Halloway Hardware had been, and to sit for a while in the parking lot of First Methodist where my parents had gone to church for 40 years. The building on the square was a candle and pottery shop now. Clean windows, a nice sign, nothing wrong with it. I sat in my car and looked at it for a few minutes. Then I went to the cemetery. I sat between my parents' graves for about an hour. The cedar trees were moving the way they always moved, and the sky was the flat gray of December, and I was cold, but I did not want to leave yet. I thought about the peppermints, the jar on the counter that had been there since before I was born. My father had refilled that jar every Monday morning. He bought them in bulk from a wholesale supplier in Nashville, and he kept a case in the back, and every Monday he refilled the jar. He said it was the kind of thing that was small enough to do and large enough to matter. A candy in a jar. Something to offer. Something that said you are welcome here. The new shop had a different jar on the counter. I had looked through the window. A jar of wrapped chocolates. Different candy. Same instinct. Something to offer. Something that says you are welcome. I thought my father would have liked that. Not the same candy, but the same idea. The continuity of small gestures of welcome in a building where he had made thousands of them. I sat between the two graves and I told him about the jar. I do not know if that is a thing you believe in or not, the talking to graves. I am not sure I believe in it exactly. But I told him about the jar, and I told him the building looked well taken care of, and I told him I had done what I could do and it had finally worked out. I told him I missed him. I told him I missed the Sunday calls. I told him I was going to be all right. Then I stood up and I brushed the cold grass off my coat, and I walked back to my car, and I drove home to Knoxville. I do not know what comes after this. I am 43 years old, and I have been carrying something for 7 years, and now the carrying is done and I am figuring out what I do with my hands now that they are empty. That is not a complaint. Empty hands are better than what I had. Empty hands are the start of something. I am going to find out what. My name is Diane Halloway. My father's name is Ray. He kept peppermints on the counter and called me every Sunday at 8 in the morning, and he did not leave without saying goodbye. The record says so now. That is everything. That is the whole story. There is a practical question I had not thought about until after the trial. What do you do with the notebooks? 3 volumes. The first one started the month Brenda answered my father's phone for the first time. The handwriting in the early pages is neat, almost careful. The writing of a person who is not sure yet what she is documenting and wants to get it right. By the second volume, the handwriting is faster. I knew by then that I was not going to stop, and the neatness mattered less than the getting down. The third volume is almost illegible in some places. The entries made at odd hours. In the car, standing in parking lots, writing quickly before the detail faded. Marcus Threlkeld returned the notebooks to me after the trial concluded. He had made copies for the record. The originals came back in a manila envelope with my name on it. I sat with the envelope for about a day before I opened it. When I opened it, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Old paper and ink, and the particular smell of something that has been in a file cabinet for several years. I turned to the first page. The date I had written at the top of the first entry was 7 years. And 4 months before the day I was sitting reading it, I read through all 3 volumes. It took me most of an afternoon. Reading them from the end backward through time was a strange experience. I knew the ending and I was reading through the middle, and then through the beginning, and the beginning showed a woman who did not yet know what the middle and the end would cost her. She was writing carefully, and she was afraid, and she was determined, and she did not know what was coming. I finished the 3rd volume, which was actually the first, and I sat for a while. Then I put the notebooks back in the envelope, and I put the envelope in the top of my closet, and I left them there. Not because I wanted to forget them. Because they had served their purpose. The information in them was in the record now, where it belonged. The notebooks could rest. I could rest. My mother Eleanor was a woman who believed in saying what you meant. Not harshly. She was not blunt for the sake of bluntness. But she believed that clarity was a form of kindness, and that ambiguity was usually the result of someone protecting themselves rather than someone else. She would have known about Brenda in an afternoon. That is what I believe. She would have sat across from her at the Sunday dinner table, and she would have watched the performance, and she would have known. She had a particular gift for seeing through the surface of a thing to whatever was operating underneath it. She would have said something to my father. She would have said it carefully, and she would have said it once, and she would have said it clearly. My father would have listened because he always listened to my mother in the way that people listen to someone they trust completely. I think about this sometimes. Whether the fact of my mother being alive would have changed what happened. I think it would have. Not because she had any power that I lacked. Because my father would have trusted her perception in a way that my perception was not trusted. In part because Brenda had spent years building the narrative of me as the resentful stepdaughter. My mother did not get the chance to see it. She was gone before Brenda arrived, and the timing of that was part of what made Brenda possible. My father was alone and lonely, and the loneliness made him want to believe that what he had found was real. It was not real. My mother would have known in an afternoon and said so once, clearly, and that would have been that. I am glad I knew my mother. I am glad I had the version of her attention that teaches you how to pay attention. The way she moved through the world, noticing things, naming what she noticed, choosing clarity over comfort. I learned it from her. It is the thing she gave me that turned out to matter most. She gave me the notebook, in a sense. Not literally, but the habit of recording. The belief that observed truth should be written down because written truth is harder to dismiss than felt truth. She kept a journal her whole adult life. I grew up watching her write in it at the kitchen table after dinner. Small observations. What she had noticed that day. I did the same thing for 7 years in 3 volumes, and it brought my father home. She would have been glad. She would have said something about it that was true and clear and short. That was her way. She would have said 3 or 4 words, and they would have been exactly right, and I would have cried, and then we would have made tea and talked about something else. I miss her the way I miss the ground under my feet when I am dreaming about falling. Like something foundational. Like the thing you do not notice until it is not there. She and my father are next to each other on the hill outside Cedar Hollow, with the cedar trees moving in the wind above them. That is something. That is the one good thing that the 7 years produced that I did not have before. He is home. He is next to her. Whatever comes after whatever this is, they are in it together. That is what I told him at the graveside. That is the thing I said before I stood up and walked back to my car. I said you are home. I said she is right here. I said you are not alone anymore. Then I drove back to Knoxville and started figuring out what I do with my empty hands. My name is Diane Hillaway. My father came home. That is the whole story. That is everything. 9 days in a courtroom is a long time when the subject of the courtroom is your father. I drove down from Knoxville every morning. I had taken leave from work. My supervisor had been generous about it. She said, take what you need. I took 9 days, and I sat in the gallery of the Hardin County Courthouse behind the prosecution table, and I watched the case that 7 years of keeping notebooks had helped build be laid out piece by piece. The prosecutor was a woman named Linda Hargrove. She was methodical and precise, and she had a gift for making complicated financial records legible to people who did not spend their lives reading financial records. She did not dramatize. She did not perform. She just laid the evidence on the table and explained what it meant and moved to the next piece. I had given her a copy of the notebooks before the trial. She had her investigators reconstruct the timeline independently from official records, but she said the notebooks had been useful as a map. She said the notebooks showed the shape of what had happened from the outside looking in over 7 years, and that shape had helped her understand where to look. Brenda sat at the defense table in a dark dress, and she maintained an expression of calm wrongness throughout the 9 days that I recognized from the search events 7 years before. She had the same capacity for performed composure that she had always had. The jury was not me. The jury did not have 7 years of watching the performance. But they had the evidence. Wayne's testimony. The financial records. The cell records. The jewelry in the pawnshop receipt. The property records. The physical evidence from the dig. The defense argued that Wayne was unreliable. That the financial records showed mismanagement, not malice. That the property connection was circumstantial. Linda Hargrove answered each argument with a document. With a date. With a record that existed independently of anyone's interpretation. My father had kept meticulous records at the hardware store. 31 years of invoices and payments and supplier contracts and tax returns. Linda Hargrove used those records to establish what his financial situation had been before Brenda arrived, and what it had become after. The contrast was not ambiguous. The money had moved in a direction, and the direction was away from my father, and toward Brenda's accounts. I listened to all of it. 9 days. I did not look away. I owed him that, the full attention of the 9 days. He had not been able to speak for himself in that room, and I was there and I was going to pay attention to every word said in his name. On the last afternoon of testimony, Linda Hargrove showed a photograph. It was a photograph of my mother's bracelet. The one from the cedar box. She showed it to the jury, and she explained where it had been found, and when it had been sold, and how the sale connected to the pawnshop records and the pawnshop records to the account that received the money. I had not known they were going to show the bracelet photograph. I was not prepared for it. I sat in the gallery and I looked at it and I thought about my mother's wrist, and about the cedar box in the top of the closet, and about the June afternoon when I had gone looking for it and found it gone. I did not cry. I saved the crying for the car. What I did was take a breath and hold it, and let it out, and make a note in the margin of my legal pad. The bracelet. Date of sale. Account number. The record existed. The record was being read in a courtroom. That was enough. That was everything it needed to be. The town of Cedar Hollow handled the verdict the way small towns handle things that require them to reconcile what they believed with what turned out to be true. Slowly, without a lot of direct acknowledgement, with the particular quietness of people who are processing something and are not ready to speak about it yet. Some people spoke directly. Margaret Forsyth called me. The retired plumber Gary Sims sent a card. A woman from my mother's Bible study group left a voicemail that I saved and have listened to several times because she said something I needed to hear. She said Cedar Hollow had failed Ray Halloway, and Cedar Hollow had failed me, and she was sorry for it. Most people did not speak directly. They showed up at the burial with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the ground, and they let the silence stand in for what they could not yet say. I understood. Accountability is a process, and it does not always have words right away. There was one conversation I had not expected. 2 weeks after the burial, a man named Tim Alderton came to find me. He had been one of the loudest voices in the early years of my father's disappearance, calling me bitter. He had been at the search events. He had believed Brenda completely. He was in his 60s now, and he stood on the sidewalk outside the diner where I had stopped for coffee, and he said he owed me an apology. I looked at him. He was not comfortable. He was doing something that cost him something, and I could see that it cost him. I said thank you for saying so. He said he had been wrong, and he wanted me to know he knew it. I said I appreciated that. He nodded. He did not say anything else. He walked back to his truck. That was the apology. It was enough. It was a man telling the truth in a small, uncomfortable moment on a sidewalk, and that was sufficient. I did not need a ceremony. What I needed, I had already received. My father's name said correctly. The truth in the record. Cedar Hollow will carry this for a long time. Not in an obvious way. In the way that communities carry the things that happened in them that they did not prevent. It becomes part of the texture of the place. Part of what people know about what their community is capable of, good and bad, and what it requires of them going forward. I hope it makes them more careful, more willing to trust the person who says something is wrong, less quick to decide that the grieving spouse is telling the truth, and the worried family member is the problem. I hope it makes one person in Cedar Hollow stop before they make the easier assumption, and ask whether the other assumption is also possible. That would be enough. If one person pauses in Cedar Hollow because of what happened to my father, that would be enough. My name is Diane Halloway. I am from Cedar Hollow, Tennessee. I am the daughter of Ray and Eleanor Halloway. I kept 3 volumes of notebooks, and I made the quarterly calls, and I did not put it down. My father came home. That is the whole story. That is everything.